Greetings, friends, and welcome to this segment of the podcast. This is the first bit that we've got where we're interviewing someone, and we have here with us Damien Pearse. Now, Damien is a specialist therapist, and we'll get to know a little bit more about Damien and his work background and stuff like that. But I was particularly interested in engaging with Damien and having Damien come on the podcast in response to like one of the questions that we got a couple episodes ago, because I felt like I gave the best possible answer that I could, but then I also felt that perhaps the listeners and perhaps the question asker might have a little bit of colour to the question brought to it, where it might have been grey in the past. And if I remember correctly, the question was with regard to the behavioural elements of trauma. How do you overcome the things that the trauma makes you do from a behavioural point of view? How do you get over those? But anyway, I believe we will get there. I believe if there is an answer, we will touch upon it.
He's probably the guy to ask.
I think so. But let's just set the scene a little bit, first of all. Damien, welcome to the podcast. It's really nice to have you here. Tom and I have been keen to explore your skill set for some time now. And we've had to cancel appointments because of work commitments and things like that. And that's just the way things are. But thank you very much for making the time to come and talk to us today. And I guess the first sort of question is really aimed towards your work experience, your life experience, and all the things that brought you to be doing what you're doing here. And it's kind of the watershed moments, really. What brought you to be working in the mental health field? What led you here? That sort of stuff.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Chris, and nice to meet you also, Tom, and a real privilege to be here. So thank you so much for asking me. The watershed moments, I mean, I guess, you know, like anyone, I sort of experienced my own emotional pain growing up. You know, we've all kind of experienced that sort of suboptimal parenting, not blaming parents for anything, but they're not perfect. And we sort of experience our own sort of doses of shame and anxiety as we grow up. But I think for me, what really shaped my sort of early days was my school experience. And I experienced quite a lot of bullying while I was at school. And as a result of that, a lot of shame and anxiety that was attached. And I think because of that, I developed a number of coping strategies to deal with that emotional pain, which served me quite well as a young person. So going through university, you know, the drink, the drugs, all of that sort of stuff, coping strategy to deal with shame and anxiety. And I went into a profession that was really well suited to those coping strategies in terms of emotional pain. So I went, my first job was as a journalist. And of course, you know, as a journalist, first of all on regional papers, and then national papers, and then in TV, it was all about that sort of hedonistic lifestyle, and it really sort of was in line with those coping strategies. And so I never really thought about them as coping strategies. I just thought about them as having a lot of fun. And that went on, you know, through my 20s and into my sort of early 30s. But there came a point, I think, with you know, as with happens with a lot of people, where those coping strategies start to sort of backfire. And I was starting to behave more and more like a person that I didn't want to behave like. You know, it was kind of like, I think all of us, all human beings, have got a sort of good inner core, but we develop these strategies to sort of cope with pain, and then we start to behave in ways that aren't in line with our values and who we want to be. And certainly that happened for me. And I went through a few years of really behaving not like the sort of person that I would imagine someone writing a eulogy about, you know, when I die. And I think it came to a point where I was feeling so much shame about that sort of stuff, about how I was, that I was almost sort of on my knees, really. And I reached out for help, sort of professional help, and went into my own therapy. And it was there really that I discovered a whole sort of new world of awareness that was completely new to me, and sort of a whole interest in psychology which developed. And I decided to first of all do a master's in experimental psychology at the University of Sussex, and when still working part-time as a journalist, and then decided to work towards my professional doctorate in psychology, and spent the next 5 years doing that, and became a psychologist, and then developed a particular interest in trauma, as I'm sure we'll explore. But sorry if that was a bit of an elongated backstory, but that's kind of how I arrived where I am today.
I will quickly say, as someone who's been a journalist, I completely know what you mean with that career path. It is often a path to self-destruction, and I think that's just what journalism's like. It's very fast-paced, and there's a lot of I don't even know if it's if I would describe it as macho culture, but it's very much a case of everyone is against each other to get the best story. I don't know if it's still like that now, but it was when I was there, and it was a brutal atmosphere, and I left, I think, for similar reasons. It was just a really bad culture and a bad environment to be around. I don't know if that was one of the primary reasons that you kind of wanted to get out.
I think you're right, Tom. I think that is one of the primary reasons I wanted to get out, because I think you get sort of brought into that culture, and you start to act according to that culture without really questioning what you're actually doing. And there were so many things that I was doing that I didn't, I sort of justified because my news editor was telling me to do. And I just thought, well, okay, you just do them. You go and you knock on someone's door when their child dies, and you ask them to give them a school photograph, and you do everything you possibly can to manipulate the outcome, and of course, you can carry on doing that, and while your ego is still young, it feels good, but you get to a point, I think, when you start to question that sort of stuff, and you start to think, well, who am I? Am I really this sort of person? And eventually the shame starts to creep up, and then you add on the coping strategy for shame, which for me was alcohol and drugs, and then you get yourself into real trouble.
Well, it sounds like we've gone through a similar journey, actually, I have to say.
It's good to identify, isn't it?
Yeah. Chris, did you have something you wanted to add to that? You look like you're deep in thought.
Yeah, because some of what you were describing there really reminds me of the concept that I teach people with regard to the stress container. And so if you can conceptualize like a bucket or some sort of container, and you constantly pour stress in, and these stresses could be stuff that's going on in your life, send feelings of pain or guilt or shame, plus editorial stresses with people saying you've got to go and do this and X, Y, Z, and it's all this fast paced. And the coping strategies generally allow that bucket to be emptied. You put a tap on it, and then that coping strategy allows it to be emptied. But when we use these dysfunctional coping mechanisms like you're describing, alcohol, drugs, it could be avoidance, it could be any number of unhelpful coping strategies, it kind of clogs up that tap. And then the thing fills up and it spills out. And I think that's what you're describing, if I may say so, with regard to sort of acting in a way that isn't consistent with your values, or that could be some of these stress signatures that we have, whereby we begin shouting, or we begin shutting down, or we begin avoiding, whatever it is. And so I'm kind of interested, I suppose, to take the conversation in the direction of the things that you have replaced some of these dysfunctional coping strategies with personally, or if you would rather talk more broadly about the things that you think people can do to replace some of these quite unhelpful coping strategies.
Yes, yeah, and I think you're touching there on a question really, which is kind of what makes you sort of mentally healthy. What constitutes kind of mental health? How can you kind of live in a way that allows you to behave more flexibly, I guess. For me, the first thing that we need to do is to recognize what the emotional landscape you have within you is. Yeah. So in order for us to behave in these helpful or unhelpful ways, first of all, you need to know what's going on inside. So we all need to know that, for example, that anxiety is normal, and that what constitutes anxiety is a mixture of things like thoughts and beliefs, but also body sensations. And once we get to know what they are and how they function in our body, then we can start to open up to them and make space for them. And when we make space for them, we become less reactive, and we can start to choose our behavioral repertoire. So without choosing that behavior, without making that space, we become a slave to what's actually going on, rather than being able to sort of unhook from our inner experience and actually choose the direction and choose to move in the direction of our values. If that makes sense, Chris.
I think it does. If I can reflect back a little bit, sort of what I've heard and what I absolutely love about what you've just said there. Is it all right to kind of try and put it in my own words to check my understanding, I suppose? First of all, I think we're talking about emotional literacy, understanding the thoughts and feelings and emotions that arise in us, knowing them, recognizing them, seeing them. Then it's about, to a certain degree, examining those unconscious thought processes that led us to the place where we happen to be in that moment, that sort of psychological location, or however we want to term it, a geographical, emotional landscape, and then changing those and addressing them and going through your sort of emotional thought, feeling audit. Am I getting there at all? Have I understood?
Really getting there. Yeah, I mean, I think the first, you're right. So the first stage is to understand your inner landscape. The second stage is to sort of unhook from it so that you can observe it. And then the third stage is to make a choice. Which way do you move with that yuckiness of life? You know, no one can get rid of the yuckiness of life, you know, that kind of the emotional pain that we inevitably feel. But when we're hooked into it, when it's kind of like this, yeah, we can't see where we're going. We need to recognize it. We need to sort of push it down a little bit. It's still there. Yeah, it's still there. But when we recognize it, we acknowledge it, we know what it is, and we push it down, we can at least know which direction we're going to choose to go in. And I think what's really, really important with mental health is to get a sense of our own values, you know, get a sense of what values are really important to us. It goes back to the eulogy thing that I was talking to about with Tom there, you know, when we are if you imagine ourselves at our funeral, yeah, or at our 80th birthday, if we don't want to be so morbid, or 50th birthday, or whatever it is, you know, how do we want someone to speak about us at that moment? And can we allow those, and that gives us a sense of what our values are, and can we allow those values to be sort of compass points that guide us in our behavior? But we can only do that when we unhook from that emotional experience in the first place. So we need to recognize the emotional experience. We need to unhook from it, and then we need to make a conscious decision to move in the direction of our values rather than away from our values, which obviously brings all of the shame, etc.
Tom, mate, have you ever considered the concept of your eulogy? I haven't, and now I am. It's really powerful.
I think some people, I mean, you're talking about coping strategies and things like that. I think some people do get into drugs and alcohol not necessarily as a coping mechanism, but as a choice. And I think you have to acknowledge that side as well. And I suppose that can develop into a coping strategy, right? It can start off innocent and then become something a lot more sinister. I'd be curious about you talking or exploring that a bit, because I've always thought that's interesting how someone can go into something like that completely innocent, and it can be a, you know, a way to enjoy themselves, and then the next minute it's kind of tearing their life apart.
Yes, yeah. You're so right there, Tom. You know, I think, let's just imagine. Let's frame this through the sort of lens of values. Okay, so let's imagine that I asked you what your Chris's top values were. And one of those values was connection, or friendliness, or perhaps sociability. That was a value that was really important to you. And you could then sort of say, well, okay, drinking, having a few pints down the pub was in line with that value of connection. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's kind of like, okay, that is a healthy thing to do. I drink, have a few pints, and it takes me in the direction of that value of connection and friendliness. Now, the problem comes when we use alcohol to avoid emotional pain rather than take us in the direction of our values. So if, for example, we start to feel anxiety and shame, and as a way to avoid that feelings, or those feelings of anxiety or shame, or whatever, loneliness, whatever it might be, we start to drink to avoid those emotions, then we can start to see how it could quite easily get into a habit that takes us into in a direction of disconnection. So you could see how you might use 3 bottles of wine every night at night just to sort of take away the pain of the day, and you would find yourself isolating more rather than moving in the direction of connection, which would be towards your values. So I think when we think about behaviors, we've got to think about, is this behavior taking me towards the sort of person I want to be, towards the values that I find really important? Or is this behavior, say drinking, taking me away from the sort of person I want to be?
I was literally just about to say that myself. There's a common sense element there of you need to have a bit of self-awareness of when something that is just a friendly habit is becoming something out of control. Is that what you're trying to say? I
think so. And I think it's when it's about emotional avoidance, when it becomes something that you're doing to avoid emotional pain, then there is always a danger that it could become a sort of a maladaptive habit, for sure.
But how does the average person, say me, I mean, Chris is probably different because this is what he's involved in. But for an average person who's not up on all of the techniques and the things that Chris talks about, and that obviously you've, as a psychologist, about, how do you get that message across to the average person? Because they're probably going to be unaware of it. Most people would not know that they were going down that path, would they?
I don't think they would be aware. And I think that's why things like addictions are so tricky, because they often start quite adaptively and then develop into sort of maladaptive behaviors. I think you start to know it yourself when you start to realize that you're acting in ways that bring you shame. I think shame is the key to all of this. When you start to feel that actually you're not behaving as you would like to behave, you start to realize that perhaps this behavior isn't what you want to do. And for me, my personal experience was that dragged on for many years, and it kind of went on until I ended up on my knees and I was, I don't mind sort of disclosing this sort of stuff. I was sort of walking down the street after a night out and just muttering to myself things like, I'm a piece of shit. Why am I doing this? Why am I being unfaithful to my girlfriend? Why am I lying to this person? Why have I just manipulated someone into an interview as a journalist when really they're really suffering, And of course, when you land in that position, it becomes very, very painful. So I think in answer to your question, Tom, it's not easy. I don't think it's easy to suddenly realize when you kind of moved from functional to dysfunctional, but it's
I think last question then from me for a bit, and then I'll move over to Chris, because I have to ask this now because I'm curious. What preventative measures then can you recommend for someone to realize that they're going down the wrong path? Because there must be some advice that you can give to the average person to maybe help them realize.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is quite helpful, if you're not, either you could go to a therapist and do this with a therapist, or you can do it on your own. There's a very simple thing that you can do on Google, it's what they call a values sort. So go onto Google, put in values sort into Google, and it will give you a list of 50 values or 50 or 60 values, and it will allow you to work out what you feel are the most important values for you, and you can whittle them down to 5 values, and you can put them as post-it notes on your computer or on your fridge or on your phone or wherever feels helpful. And you can ask yourself before you start to do something, is this behavior in line with this value? Yeah. And if the answer is no, then you can start to think, well, perhaps whatever it is that I'm doing isn't who I want to be. And then you can start to think, well, maybe I need to address this. Another thing you can start to do is to really start to go inside in terms of go inside your body and mind, and ask yourself whether you are doing a particular behavior or action in reaction to a strong emotion. So are you reaching out for that first glass of wine in the evening because you feel very, very stressed? If the answer is yes, then there is going to always be a danger that you start to pair stress with alcohol and you go down a difficult route. If the answer is no, I'm reaching out for this beer because I want to go and have a chat with Chris and I really want to find out how his life is going, then of course that is something that is in line with your value of connection. So really get to know what your values are, I think is my answer to your question there. And then get to know whether or not you're behaving in response to strong emotions inside.
I love that. I think it's a very ethical outlook, actually. Yeah, it's a good way to measure your inner self as well. I think it's a good little technique. I remember that myself. Good
stuff. And one tip I would really give and is write your own eulogy. Yeah, write. And if it's
that's a bit too much right now. But I'm only 30. But
okay, well, write something that you'd like to be read out at your 40th birthday. Yeah, and what would you want someone to say about you at your 40th birthday party, how you've acted in the last 10 years. And then that will give you a sense of what your values are and what you how you want to act.
Okay. Chris, I can see you're thinking deeply again.
I can't help it. This is amazing stuff. So, I mean, I absolutely love the concept of the value sort. I never heard of it before. And I feel like as soon as I get off this call, I want to go and do a value sort. I think that is a really valuable concept in addition to everything else we've discussed for any of our listeners, with regard specifically to the listener that sent in the question about overcoming the behavioral elements of trauma. And just to summarize that bit, I think the value audit, the value sort, is the thing which is going to help you determine whether XYZ behavior or ABC behavior is in fact consistent with how you want to express your time here in the world. I don't really have anything else to say about that other than that I'm already in love with the idea and I haven't even Googled it. But I just think it's fantastic. I've never done anything like that. The eulogy bit, still turning that over in my mind. Still like the idea. I'm 40 and no one has read out a speech about me on my 40th or anything like that. I'm wondering what could be said now about my 30s and what could possibly help me chart a course through my 40s into my 50s that might help also guide me, because I'm at my heart, I think I'm a seeker, and so these sort of conversations really stoke and move me. Yeah, they stoke a fire in me, and they really move me to take action about things. So thank you very much.
We are very specific types of people, though, Chris. So I think you have to acknowledge that maybe this approach doesn't work for everyone. I think you have to have a very high sense of personal pride and you have to want to do good in the world for that value system to work, surely. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be applicable to you. Is that right? It'd be hard to apply it to everyone.
Yeah, well, I think it's. I don't think it necessarily needs a very sort of strong ethical mindset, because I think your values can be your own uniquely held, personally avowed values. Yeah. So this isn't about picking values that are ethical for everybody. Someone I would never change someone's values. So if for example I was working with a psychopath and their value was to be, I don't know, cruel to animals, I mean, I don't agree with that value, but you've got to respect that this is a value for that psychopath and that this is what they want to be working with. You would obviously try and gently sort of encourage them not to do it and report them if they were starting to kill dogs and humans and all of the rest. But the key to it is that these are your personal values, and that when you act in line with them, you naturally get a sense of well-being because you're being your true self. So it's not as if we're trying to be really ethical. What we want to do is we want to be ourselves. We want to act in ways that make us feel good. And if we think about this podcast, and for me, one of my values is courage. Yeah, I really value that. I value that value of courage. Yeah. Now, it would have been very easy for me to say, right, I get a bit anxious when I'm doing podcasts or giving presentations. And so, you know what, I'll make an excuse and just sit on the sofa and do something else. It'll be easy for me to do that and I'll avoid that emotional pain. But for me, what's really important is to feel that emotional pain, to know that this emotional pain that I'm feeling now and before this podcast, that slight anxiety, my beating heart and all of that stuff, I can open up to that. I can be willing to experience it and still move in the direction of that value of courage, but also of learning, of curiosity, of connection, all of those things. It's about experiencing emotional pain and still doing what matters. I think that is mental health. If you can do that, then you have that flexibility. How does that sound?
That sounds really good, and I think it's to do with not avoiding the negative. It's accounting for the negative, acknowledging the negative, and then moving through it as and when you need to. Because there's a lot of times, a lot of mental health advice would come down on the side of avoidance of those negative triggers, or however you want to term them. But I think sometimes confronting them can be therapeutic, and whether it's nervousness about a podcast or some other sort of challenge that stands in your way of reaching your values, then taking account of that, moving through it is what I take away from that. However, I am interested in the point of view that Tom's brought onto the table with regard to I'm enraptured by all of this, partly because I'm sort of working in the field and I'm thinking about how I can develop myself to be a more complete and better person. And I've always been interested in that. But Tom's right. Not everyone's that interested in, self-development. Not everyone's that interested in an internal audit of your emotional state. No one's in, there are people who I talk to on a regular basis who have never meditated. Not once. They've heard of it. Maybe they've even downloaded the app on their phone, but they never used it. And so I think that was a really good question, Sonke. I'm getting a bit wrapped up in the professional side of things here and the conceptual side of things. So I think that's really good advice for people across the board. And what I take away from it from Tom's point of view, I suppose, as well, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, if you heard this or not, was along the lines of, if things are getting in your way, stopping you from doing the things that you want to do, or causing you to have problems with, the other people that you value in your life, or if it is in some way presenting a problem to you, that's the time when you need to begin to think about behavior change. And it doesn't mean always you have to do that with a professional. It can be facilitated by a professional, can it not? But in general terms, you can do a thoughtful process and, adjust things in order to reach the target that you've now got in mind. I don't really have anything else to say about that, but what do you think?
I think your favorite word comes to mind as well. Well, one of your favorite words, Chris, authenticity. I couldn't help but think about that when you were talking about the psychopath tangent, because you're basically, you're not telling the psychopath that, we don't know if it's a man or a woman, but we're not saying that they can't strangle cats or whatever they get some strange kick out of. We just want that. We want them to be authentic and ensure that it goes with their core values. Is that what you're trying to say?
That's what I'm trying to say. But I'm obviously I'm not.
You're not advocating it, obviously.
It was an extreme example, but it's just this idea. I suppose I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't saying that this is just something for people who want to be ethical. This isn't that. This is just getting a sense of what your own values are, so that they can be compass points in order to move towards, in a behavioural way.
And that's great. You have to look at things like this very matter of fact like that, I think. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So, yeah, I agree. Chris, did you have anything else you wanted to say? I think we wanted to talk a little bit about insomnia, didn't we?
Yeah, we wanted to touch on that because I understand that is an area of specific expertise that you have, Damien. Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm interested in insomnia professionionally, but also because I've experienced it myself, and know how painful it is. And I think I'm not sure whether you guys have either, but it's something that certainly in my professional practice, a lot of people come to me with, and there's not much out there in terms of really good sort of evidence-based literature around insomnia.
So how do you approach it then? Like when we think about insomnia and we think about someone who is reaching out for help with getting a good night's sleep, you could talk about your personal experiential advice. This worked for me, that worked for me. People say, I've heard allegedly that this works for other people. We can talk about sleep hygiene. We can talk about sunlight exposure. We can talk about, the use of screens. And, one of the tips I've heard is go and brush your teeth again. If you've been lying there trying to fall asleep for more than an hour, go and brush your teeth again because there's some signal. But when you are professionally tackling insomnia, one must presume that this is rooted, first of all, in identifying what the causes are. Am I right or wrong about that?
Well, I think you're to an extent you're right. So we need to work out what the causes are, but I think they're more complex than people think they are, or at least they're not as. I think one of the big problems that people who are insomniacs have is this narrative of sleep hygiene, which kind of really does kind of interfere with their sleep in the end. So if we're talking about the causes of insomnia, let's just rewind a second. Sleep hygiene is great, yeah. If you want a good night's sleep and you're not an insomniac, yeah, by all means have a nice herbal bath. By all means, have an eye mask and do a bit of meditation before you go to sleep. You may well sleep more deeply, but if you are an insomniac, that I suspect that is not going to help, because what you have a fear of if you're an insomniac is not sleeping. It starts off as a life event normally with insomnia. So for example, you have work stress, which stops you from sleeping very well, or you have a relationship breakup that you're thinking about a lot. So that is the initial trigger. But most people will sort of get over that life event and then start to sleep normally again. But for insomniacs, what happens is rather than get over the life event, they start to fear not sleeping. The sleep becomes the issue. So they start to develop a phobia about not sleeping, and the life event might slip away, but sleep becomes the phobia. So you can tell them then to do as many things as they possibly can to get to sleep. But the problem with that is that they start to try even harder to get to sleep. Now, in order to get to sleep, you need to be de-aroused. You need to be in a state of physiological de-arousal. And if you're trying to get to sleep by having a herbal bath or by doing a meditation, you're naturally going to be starting to think, oh, well, I can't sleep and I'm doing these things to get to sleep. And you're going to be sort of working yourself up into more anxiety. So there's a real paradox there. And it's a real cruel irony for people trying to get to sleep, that the more you do to try and get to sleep, the less likely you are to get to sleep. And people need to learn a different approach.
I've got to ask about the genetic element, because I think there's certain elements of sleep that are genetic. Is that right? I mean, I think the amount of deep sleep that you get and REM sleep and the deeper levels, there is a element where you can't necessarily control getting a better night's sleep. Is that right?
I think you're right, Tom, there to an extent. I mean, I think there is a genetic component, to not being able to sleep very well. And certain people will naturally sleep for 4 hours and certain people will naturally sleep for 10 hours. Certain people are sort of night owls. Other people are larks. They sleep really early and sleep really late, whatever it is. So there is that genetic component. Females tend to have worse sleep than males. People who are naturally depressed sleep worse than other. But as you get older, you sleep less. So there is that genetic component. But that isn't really the problem of the insomniac. It becomes a problem for an insomniac when they start to worry about their sleep. And that then becomes a sort of a bit of a loop that they get stuck in. I don't think there's much you can do about the genetics, but if you then start to worry about the fact, if you have the genetics and then you start to worry about the fact that you're not sleeping, you're likely to sleep even less. So you the genetics might get you to sleep for 6 hours, but if you're then starting to worry about only sleeping for 6 hours, the likelihood is that you work yourself up into a frenzy so that you only sleep for 2 hours. And you need to learn methods so that you are able to naturally get to sleep again. And I'm happy to go into a few of those methods if we have time. But
yeah, I think that would be great to go into some of those methods for the benefit of our listeners.
For sure. So the first thing I would say, and I'm just conscious of time a little bit, the first thing I would say is drop all of the safety behaviors around your sleep. Yeah. If you can, make a list of everything that you've tried to do to get to sleep. And you'll often find the list is about that long. I once had a client who had about 60 things that she did to try to get to sleep, including buying a £5,000 bed.
That sounds like obsession, doesn't it?
To get to sleep. So make a big list of everything that you've done to try and get to sleep, and make a sort of brave decision to drop those to drop those safety strategies, if you like. The next thing to do is to map out all of the experiences that you have that are sleep related. So all of those sleep-related thoughts that you have just as you approach bedtime, the sleep-related sensations you have, and the sleep-related emotions. So, for example, you might start to make a note of some of those sleep-related thoughts that happen. Say at 8 o'clock, you might have a thought, "I'm not going to sleep tonight." Yeah. Then your heart starts racing. Then you start saying, well, if I don't sleep for 8 hours, how am I going to function at work tomorrow? And if I don't function at work tomorrow, then I'm not going to sleep the next night. So to become a real sort of mapper of your inner experience around sleep. Know all of your thoughts, all of the body sensations, and all of the emotions that are associated with that. What we then tend to do is like what I said before, we try to avoid those thoughts and sensations and emotions. But what we want to do instead is lean into them instead. Yeah. So what we try to do with those sleep-related experiences is cultivate our welcoming skills. And so this is a mindfulness ability. So we, instead of dismissing our heartbeat and kind of, I shouldn't be feeling like this, I'm not really an insomniac, I hate this, I should just do some breathing exercises, maybe if I breathe deeply enough they'll go away. we exercise what we call welcoming skills. So that is literally opening up to the sensation and saying something as simple as, here you are, I noticed my heart beating again. Here it goes. It's a regular visitor at 8, 9 p.m. every single night. Nice to see you, heartbeat. Welcome to the nighttime experience. It's good to see you again. Yeah. There's that urge to pop a pill in order to get to sleep. You're a familiar sort of visitor again to my sort of nighttime experience. And it's good to see you again. Welcome to the party. So what we're trying to do is we're sort of introducing a playfulness around these inner experiences. And what we're engaging our natural human welcoming response, which is wired into all humans. So you can imagine sort of old tribes that used to sort of meet each other, there initially exists this sort of hostility between the tribes. But there comes a point then when one tribe accepts the other tribe and there is a welcome, maybe a handshake or a hello or a greeting. And there is a natural sort of de-arousal in both members of those tribes. But we can also do that with our inner experiences. So when we recognize, first of all, we map out all of these inner experiences which are stopping us from sleeping, we can then turn to them with a welcoming skill, which naturally de-arouses us. So it's a practice that we can get into that almost feels sort of paradoxical. Rather than trying to avoid them, we lean into them, and more than that, we welcome them, and then we start to de-arouse, and then we start to sleep naturally.
I think that is the perfect place to leave it. I think that's really good, actionable, workable advice. And so if anyone is struggling with insomnia or sleeplessness, however it's affecting you, let's try this, eh? I think that's really good. It's the welcoming part of it was, I think that's really achievable and doable for people. What do you think, Tom?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, nothing works better than making something lighthearted. And I think that's basically what you're trying to say, is just change the negative mindset of something into something that as humans we are more, like you say, welcoming to, so that it's not giving negative connotations as soon as that thought crops up.
It's exactly that, Tom. Exactly that. Yeah.
So thank you very much for today, Damien. I think we've both been looking forward to this for an awful long time since we first met.
I think we could keep going.
I think we could. And I wonder if, you would consider coming on again in the future another time. Thank you.
Certainly would. I feel like we didn't really do too much on trauma, and I would certainly be happy to talk more about that in future for sure. It's been really, really enjoyable, actually.
Good. Excellent. I'm pleased to hear that. So thanks very much again for coming.
Absolute pleasure. Really nice to see you both.
Excellent.